I wasn't looking for a man when I started this investigation. I was looking for a building. Specifically, I was tracing the origins of a series of Baroque administrative structures that appeared, with suspicious uniformity, across 3 continents between 1750 and 1875. The same arch colonnades, the same load-bearing ratios, the same interior acoustic chambers that no architect of the period had officially designed. I had spent the better part of 8 months cataloging these structures, cross-referencing them against known colonial construction records, and I kept running into the same dead end. The buildings existed. The blueprints did not. The construction orders were missing. And the men who supposedly built them had, in many cases, no verifiable biography before a certain point in time. That's when I found him. His name appears, briefly, partially, almost reluctantly, in a single ledger housed in a regional archive in Kazan, Russia. Not in a history book, not in an encyclopedia. In a ledger, a trade and administrative ledger from the mid-1700s, written in a script that mixes Cyrillic with something older, something that scholars who looked at it cannot fully classify. His title, as best as it can be translated, is something approximating Governor Steward of the Western Reaches. His name, rendered phonetically, appears to be something close to Alexei Volkov-Tarkhanov. But it is not his name that matters. It is what happens when you try to find anything else about him. The records stop, every time, in every archive, in every country where his administrative fingerprints appear. You find evidence of his work, his decisions, his infrastructure, and then you find nothing. No death record, no pension, no successor announcement, no official removal from post, just absence. And that is when the official explanations began to collapse. The first piece of physical evidence I examined was a photograph, not digital, not scanned from a low-resolution source, but an original albumin print, the kind produced on glass-backed silver paper that was standard in the mid-19th century. It was sourced from a private collection in Leipzig that had been partially donated to a regional German historical society, and it depicted the interior of what appeared to be a large administrative hall. Vaulted ceiling, ornate plasterwork, a series of iron chandeliers of extraordinary complexity hanging from structural points that, in the official architectural record of the building, do not exist. The hall itself was identified, by a handwritten notation on the reverse, as being Orenburg, a city that sits at the geographic boundary between European Russia and the Central Asian steppe. The notation gave a date, 1841. The building it depicted, according to every official Russian imperial record I could locate, was not constructed until 1867. 26 years after this photograph supposedly could not have been taken. I sent the print to 2 independent photographic historians, one based in Prague, one in Edinburgh, and both confirmed the same thing. The grain matched the albumin process of the 1840s. The silver oxidation pattern was consistent with originals of that age. The shadows fell correctly for a north-facing interior in late winter, given Orenburg's latitude. There was no digital manipulation. That is self-evident. The technology did not exist. But more importantly, there was no evidence of the darkroom compositing techniques occasionally used in that period to alter images. What I was looking at predated the technology to fake it in any meaningful sense. So the building existed before it was built, or rather, it existed before it was officially built, before it was officially named, before it was officially attributed to the architects whose names now appear on its foundation stone. I cross-referenced the architectural details with similar structures. The Customs House in Astrakhan, officially dated 1858. The Regional Court Building in Ufa, officially 1871. The Post and Telegraph Administration Hall in Chelyabinsk, officially 1879. All of them share the same load-bearing arch specifications, a ratio of 1 to 2.4 between pillar diameter and arch span. That does not appear in any European architectural manual of the period. When I contacted the Hermitage Museum's Architectural Research Division in St. Petersburg to ask about this ratio's origin, I received a polite response explaining that it was likely a regional adaptation of Italian Renaissance principles. No citation was provided, no source, no manual, just an explanation. I looked for the manual. It does not exist. There is something else in that Leipzig photograph that I have not yet mentioned. In the far left corner of the image, partially obscured by the edge of the frame, there is a portrait, a large, formal portrait, the kind that would hang in a government administrative building to indicate authority and hierarchy. The face is not fully visible, but the title beneath it, rendered in that same mixed Cyrillic script I encountered in the Kazan ledger, is partially readable. And what is readable matches, letter for letter, the title that appears beside the name Volkov Tarkanov. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I began to map every administrative building from the 1750s to the 1880s that shared the unattributed 1 to 2.4 arch ratio. I expected to find a cluster, perhaps a regional school of architecture that had adopted an informal standard. What I found instead was a network that crossed borders, languages, empires, and oceans in a way that should have been impossible without centralized coordination. In St. Petersburg, the old merchant exchange building on Vasilevsky Island, officially designed by Thomas de Thomond in 1805, contains interior chambers whose arch ratios do not match the Thomond's known work anywhere else. The deviation is small but consistent, 1 to 2.4. In Buenos Aires, the Cabildo building, officially dating from the colonial Spanish period, was substantially modified in the 1860s, and the modification records are incomplete. What remains shows, again, the same ratio in its restored interior colonnades. In Delhi, the old administrative buildings of the pre-Raj period, structures that British colonial authorities officially attributed to Mughal-era construction or to early company modifications, contain interior load-bearing systems whose proportions match nothing in either tradition. I found the same ratio in Riga. In Lahore, in the Old Harbor Authority building in Alexandria, Egypt, demolished in 1922, known only from engineering surveys conducted in 1908, which I located in the holdings of the British Library's India Office records. The surveyors noted the unusual arch proportions and attribute them to unknown local tradition. They move on. No one followed up. The measurements are not approximate. They are not close. They are exact. Across thousands of miles, across dozens of political systems, across languages with no common root, the same proportional system appears with consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence or parallel development. Parallel development produces variation. This produces uniformity. What administrative system was capable of standardizing construction across St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, Delhi, and Alexandria simultaneously? What authority issued those specifications? And more urgently, who were they built for? The answer, or at least the beginning of one, appears on maps. Specifically, on maps from the 1600s and 1700s that are now largely ignored, occasionally mislabeled as decorative or imprecise, and almost never discussed in mainstream historical cartography. On these maps, occupying a vast territory stretching from the Caspian Sea eastward across Central Asia and into what is now Siberia and Western China, there is a political entity labeled with a name that varies slightly by cartographer and language, but converges consistently on a single route: Tartaria, or Tartaria, or Grand Tartary. I want to be precise about this because it matters enormously. Tartaria was not a legend. It was not a myth invented by medieval travelers with poor geographic knowledge. It appears on maps produced by the Royal Geographical Society in London. It appears on French cartographic surveys. It appears on Dutch trade maps. It appears in the encyclopedic works of serious European scholars who had no reason to invent it and every professional reason to be accurate. In the 1771 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the first edition ever published, there is an entry for Tartaria that describes it as the largest country in the world by landmass. Not a province, not a region, a country, and then it disappears. Not conquered. At least not in any way that the historical record accounts for satisfactorily. Not renamed, not absorbed, not balkanized into smaller successor states through any process that left the kind of treaty records, administrative handover documentation, or population displacement evidence that every other territorial transition in history has produced. It is simply gone from the maps after a certain point. The territory remains. The maps change. The entity called Tartaria ceases to be named. ceases to be acknowledged, and the space it occupied is quietly redistributed among the expanding empires of Russia, China, and Britain as though it had always been theirs. Now consider what I told you about Volkov Tarkhanov. His title, Governor Steward of the Western Reaches. His administrative fingerprints, present across exactly the geographic corridor where Tartaria's western territories would have been. His construction standards, the same 1 to 2.4 ratio appearing in cities that sit at the precise boundary zones where Tartarian territory, as mapped in the 1700s, would have met European imperial expansion. The connection becomes impossible to ignore. When I began searching the newspaper archives, I expected silence. What I found was something more disturbing: noise followed by silence. A deliberate, terminal silence that arrives at almost exactly the same moment across multiple countries and multiple publications. The Orenburg Gubernia Gazette, 1856, carries a brief administrative notice referencing the continuation of infrastructure works under the oversight of the gubernatorial steward's office, a title that matches no official Russian imperial administrative position I can find in any other record. The notice is written as though its readers already know what the gubernatorial steward's office is. No explanation is given, no introduction. It is institutional language deployed casually, the way you reference something everyone already understands. The Kazan Commercial Register, 1863, includes a record of a land survey dispute in which the arbitrating authority is described as the representative of the Western Administrative Council, again, a body that appears nowhere in the official imperial bureaucratic structure at the time. The dispute was resolved. The resolution was binding. Whoever the Western Administrative Council was, they had real authority. The St. Petersburg Illustrated Weekly, 1871, contains a small item, 3 sentences, buried on page 7, describing the arrival in the city of a diplomatic delegation from the interior territories, whose reception was handled not by the Foreign Ministry, but by a special office of interior coordination. I spent 3 weeks trying to find any other reference to this office. There is none. The Leipzig Mercantile Chronicle, 1879, references trade agreements with Eastern territorial administrators whose authority supersedes the standard consular framework. The agreement covers timber, mineral extraction rights, and, most intriguingly, architectural labor. Architectural labor as a specific trade category, distinct from ordinary construction work. The Lahore Civil and Military Gazette, 1891, runs what appears to be a brief obituary, not for a person, but for an office. It describes a formal cessation of an unnamed administrative body that had long maintained oversight of certain construction and infrastructure interests across the northern reaches. No names, no successor, just cessation. After 1920, everything stops. The photographs stop. The reports stop. The maps change. The Smithsonian Institution's acquisition records from the 1920s and 1930s show a remarkable pattern of purchases and donations of archival material from Central Asian and Russian sources, material that was cataloged upon arrival and then, in many cases, reclassified to restricted access. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if Tartaria did not simply disappear? What if it was administered into invisibility? What if the entity we see on those 18th century maps was not destroyed but was instead methodically dismantled? Not its infrastructure, not its buildings, not its construction standards, but its identity, its name, its record, its governors. Consider what this would require. You would need to control cartographic production, achievable if you control the major European map-making centers, which by the late 1700s were largely in the hands of the same imperial powers expanding into Tartarian territory. You would need to control archival access, achievable if you have the resources to purchase, relocate, or reclassify inconvenient records. You would need to control the institutional memory of successor states, achievable if those successor states depend on you for their own legitimacy. And you would need to erase the governors, the men who administered the system, the men who knew what the system was, where it came from, what it had been. A dead governor leaves descendants who remember. A disgraced governor leaves trial records. But a governor who is simply never acknowledged, who is removed from the ledgers, whose portrait is taken down from the administrative hall, whose title is reclassified and whose name is omitted from the succession records, that governor simply ceases to have existed. Why would they do this? Because what Tartaria represented was a challenge to the legitimacy of the emerging world order. If a vast, functional, sophisticated civilization existed across Central Asia and Siberia, one capable of standardizing construction ratios across 3 continents, one capable of maintaining trade and diplomatic relationships with European mercantile centers, one whose governors signed binding arbitration agreements, then the narrative of European expansion as civilization bringing rather than civilization replacing becomes untenable. The erasure was not cruelty. It was necessity. And Volkov Tarkanov, the governor steward of the Western Reaches, was its most complete victim. They don't debate. They pretend it never existed. I submitted a formal research inquiry to 3 separate European universities with established departments of Central Asian history, asking specifically about administrative structures in the Orenburg-Kazan corridor during the 1750 to 1870 period and requesting any documentation related to non-imperial governance bodies operating in that region. 2 universities did not respond at all. The 3rd responded with a form letter directing me to publish bibliographies on Russian imperial expansion, bibliographies that, by definition, would contain only the official version of events. I am not suggesting active suppression in the dramatic sense. There are no men in black suits removing files from reading rooms. It is not active suppression. It is passive erasure. It functions through the same mechanism that causes academic journals to reject papers that cannot be properly cited because the primary sources are inaccessible. It functions through the same mechanism that causes archivists to label inconvenient documents as damaged content indeterminate, rather than translate them. It functions through the incentive structures of professional scholarship, where a researcher who publishes on Tartaria risks their career, and a researcher who ignores it risks nothing. The pattern appears across disciplines. Architectural historians who note the unexplained construction ratios attribute them to regional tradition and move on. Cartographic historians who acknowledge the extensive Tartaria map record describe it as a geographic misunderstanding and move on. Archivists who process the acquired Central Asian collections classify and restrict and move on. No single person is lying. No single institution is conspiring. The erasure is distributed across thousands of individual decisions to accept the official explanation and not ask the next question. What happens when you do ask the next question in academic circles? I can tell you from experience. You are told you are not a credentialed historian. You are told the sources you are citing are unreliable. You are told the connections you are drawing are speculative. And then, and this is the part that matters, you are not engaged with further. The conversation does not continue. There is no debate, no refutation, no counter-evidence presented. There is simply a closing of the door, a polite, final, irrevocable closing of the door. That silence is itself a kind of evidence. In 2019, a private auction house in Vienna cataloged a collection of technical instruments sourced from a dispersed estate in the Ural region of Russia. The collection included surveying equipment, drafting tools, and, most remarkably, a set of what the catalog described as architectural proportion gauges of uncertain origin. These were brass instruments, approximately 34 centimeters in length, with calibrated scales etched along their inner edges. The catalog listed them as possibly Ottoman or possibly Persian, the kind of attribution that means, in practice, we don't know and we're not going to look harder. I obtained photographs of the instruments from the auction catalog before the collection was purchased by a private buyer whose identity was not disclosed. The calibration marks on the gauges were specific and unusual. They divided a standard unit of measurement, close to, but not exactly, the Russian artisan of the period, into subdivisions that produced, at their most functional setting, a ratio of precisely 1 to 2.4. These were the tools used to build those buildings. The physical instruments that translated an abstract construction standard into plumb lines and cut stone and raised arches. They were not Ottoman. They were not Persian. Their calibration system matches nothing in the documented tool traditions of either culture. They match, with a specificity that leaves no room for coincidence, the construction standard that appears in Orenburg, in St. Petersburg, in Buenos Aires, in Delhi, in Alexandria, The auction catalog noted their unusual calibration as a curiosity and valued them at a modest sum. They sold for 3 times the estimate to the undisclosed private buyer. When I contacted the auction house to ask whether any provenance research had been conducted, I was told that the state had declined to provide documentation and that the house had accepted this as standard practice for private collections. Standard practice. Instruments that represent the physical signature of civilization pass through an auction house with no provenance, purchased by someone who did not want to be known, cataloged as a curiosity and filed away. And suddenly the brass gauges aren't an anomaly anymore. They're confirmation. I began this investigation looking for a building. I found instead the ghost of a man who administered something so large, so functional, so genuinely civilizational that the decision was made at some level and by some convergence of interests that he could never be allowed to exist in the historical record. Why does the same construction ratio appear in cities separated by 10,000 kilometers? Why do administrative records from Orenburg to Lahore reference governing bodies that have no place in any official imperial structure? Why do the maps change so suddenly and so completely and with so little explanation that the largest country in the world, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1771, simply ceases to appear within a few decades? Why do the newspaper records stop at the same moment across multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple publication traditions? Why do the instruments exist, but the manuals do not? Why does the portrait in the Leipzig photograph hang in a building that was not supposed to exist yet, beneath a title that matches a name found only in a trade ledger in Kazan? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies pattern. I don't have definitive answers, only questions. But the questions accumulate into a shape, and the shape is the outline of something real, something that functioned, something that built, something that administered, something that was, by any reasonable measure, a civilization, and something that was decided at some point to be inconvenient to acknowledge. What have we forgotten? Perhaps that history is not the past. History is what someone decided you were allowed to know about the past. And there's a profound difference between those two things. A difference measured not in years or centuries, but in the distance between what is recorded and what is real. The buildings still stand. In Orenburg, in Astrakhan, in Ufa, the arches still hold. The proportions are still there in the stone, in the plaster, in the iron of the chandeliers. You can visit them. You can put your hand against the pillar and feel the weight of something that no official history can fully explain. The man who oversaw their construction has been erased from every ledger, every portrait, every succession record, but the arches remain, and arches do not lie.